Hi, Stefan. Thank you very much for speaking with me today. So, Stefan, you're an archaeologist with a very broad range of interests. Can you please tell me a little bit more about your work at the moment?
Yeah, it's say apart from my making a living work, I research the cultural history of the northern celestial pole over the last up until now over the last say 20 millennia, and this was it kind of came upon me because as an archaeologist we are trained to not think too positive about astronomy, or to largely ignore evidence for astronomical context. So I was singing along in this choir for about a decade before going to Japan, where I was studying swords and how to polish them, how to judge them. And it was in Japan that I first encountered three swords from the early 8th century, around 700, which had the Big Dipper incised on their blades. And I was really astonished to find the Big Dipper on sword blades. I was aware that there are often sun and moon and star symbolism on Celtic swords, on Latin swords, but I've never encountered, another constellation or a constellation at all on swords. So I started to research and came across this principle of cosmological centralism, which flourished first in China, then was kind of exported to Korea and farther to Japan, where you have the respective emperors, like being the representatives of the northern celestial pole on Earth. So you have the capitals of China, even up to now. The Forbidden City is nothing else but the reflection of the polar region on Earth, and the emperor is kind of the symbol for the northern celestial pole, not necessarily the pole star, because the pole star shifted due to precession. And the same principles apply to Japan. So I found out, or my interpretation for explanation for Big Dippers on swords is that they symbolize people like circling around the emperor, like the Big Dipper circles around the pole. And you have hundreds of these swords, thousands actually, up until the 20th century in China, loads in Korea. And this gave the impulse to find out more about the cultural significance of the northern celestial pole in Europe. My thought was
So,
we see the same sky, so well, what did they think?
so the emperor was quite literally the center of the universe
Yes, yeah.
and a conduit between heaven and earth. Be sure when you see a constellation on an ancient artifact that it is the Big Dipper or that it is whatever else, some other constellation. What are the markers?
Mm-hmm. The basic markers are what a friend of mine from France, Dijon, called l'astérisme 4 plus 3, the asterism of 4 plus 3. You have a kind of quadrangular shape, 1, 2, 3, 4, and you have three dots, 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2, 3, going sometimes to the left, which would correspond to the appearance in the sky, and sometimes even for Neolithic examples going to the right, like representing the Big Dipper mirror inverted, just as is the case in modern or early modern celestial globes.
So this is something that we see in up until a couple of hundred years ago in constellations, isn't it? That we can see sometimes the constellation as we would view it from Earth looking up, or from the outside of the celestial dome looking in.
Yes. And of course, say, as I'm trained in archaeology and we all have to stick to scientific criteria, I'm very well aware that out of a larger group of dots or cupules on megalithic monuments, you can create any constellation you like. So basically, I'm concentrating on examples where there are just a few cupules and try to see if they make sense. And actually, since about 12 years or even longer, I try to find support in astronomical circles because in the meantime, I recognize very easily the Big Dipper, the Dragon, Orion, and a few other constellations, but I am not familiar with the majority of constellations visible in the sky. And since I'm trying to find support from professional astronomers, I have to admit that I have not yet met one who is familiar with the classical constellations when looking at the sky. Everybody seems to have his favorite nebula, fog among the stars, but nobody is interested in the cultural history of constellations anymore.
It's one thing to be an amateur astronomer and actually enjoy stargazing. It's probably another to be an actual professional astronomer. The interests are very different, I would imagine.
Mm-hmm. And this is something, say, the how would you put it? The understandability, can you say, the readability of
Yeah.
constellations, is in fact very, very difficult with the classical ones. The big bear doesn't look like a big bear at all. The little bear doesn't look like a little bear. The lion is very, it's very difficult to see a lion. It could as well be a horse or a sphinx. It looks very much like a sphinx, actually. And this is already one case for my favorite 3 or 4 constellations from Brittany, because they did something which I think only, well, really congenial people could think of. They they did not, as the Greeks did, they did not put together some dots and put around them some image, which is very difficult to find if you don't know it. What they did is actually they drew a line around the most conspicuous stars, and these silhouettes are represented in dozens in graves in Brittany, which date from the first half of the 5th millennium BC. And there is, of course, when I see an engraving on a stone, I want to find out about the natural example for this. And the only thing in nature which makes sense for this kind of constellation, or which makes sense for this kind of silhouette, is in fact the brightest asterisms around the pole, around 4600 BC. And
So tell me more about these stones then in Brittany especially. So you've managed to put a date on the asterism or the constellation as it's represented.
the first time I thought about this was in 2017, when I was still working for the Royal Armouries in Leeds. And this was it started off like a game. I saw these engravings which a professor from Nantes, Professor Cassen, calls a sperm whale, and a hook or a crook, and an axe blade. And then I compared these to the silhouettes of the brightest stars around the pole with by using the Stellarium, the freeware planetarium program. And then I ended up at, of course, I knew that these were already dated around the middle of the 5th century, but these representations make most sense, and this is more precise even than carbon-14 dating. They make the most concrete sense about 4600 BC, when it was part of the caudal fin, the tail fin, of the so-called whale, if you link this up to the crooked end of the hook, you have the northern celestial pole about exactly in the middle. But at that time, of course, you had no pole star as we have today. But when you were aware that the pole is in the middle between these two stars, you could determine true north with much more exactness, much more accuracy than any magnetical compass, where you have the problem of magnetical deviation.
So we're not talking about magnetic north. We're not talking about some kind of technology that relies on magnetism. This is about observation of the stars. It's about knowing where true north is, and it's about also the knowledge that the stars that are in the north are shifting.
Yes. And this sounds very daring. And of course, I try to publish it in scientific journals, but I am, well, as we say in Germany, I am sitting in between several chairs because I am an archaeologist. Nobody in archaeology considers, or well, most colleagues don't consider archaeoastronomy as a serious activity. And there is the kind of, well, very stubborn prejudice that people were consumed with much more important things than looking at the stars. For this argument, I have to say, well, all the phenomena in the surrounding environment, being the weather, the climate, the vegetation, the animals, etc., everything depends on conditions which are determined by astronomical phenomena. It's the four seasons, it's where you are situated on Earth, in which latitude, etc. So the basis for all these environments where we put millions of dollars, euros, etc., into to find out more about it by methods of natural science, all this actually finally is based on astronomical conditions. So I dare ask, why is it so stupid or esoteric to consider what is happening in the sky as relevant for the life and thought of ancient peoples?
Very often, the knowledge of the stars, or at least the movement of the sun, is interpreted in terms of agriculture. It's interpreted in terms of very practical details, in terms of knowing when to plant and when to sow and all this. So if this is correct, then you're suggesting that people's interest in the stars goes way back, much further back than agriculture potentially, but also that it's not necessarily for practical purposes. And it's quite sophisticated.
Yes, actually, I would say necessarily it has to go back far, far beyond the introduction of agriculture, because to orient oneself in one's surroundings is a fundamental need, not to get lost. And I also wonder why my colleagues have no problem with linking these indicators for stellar observation or observation of the sun to calendars. I think it's somehow funny that they try to reduce this to the purely agricultural aspects, because all the contexts where we find these indicators, they are not profane sites. They are sites that are definitely they have to be seen in the context with ritual in general, and with funeral practices, and with images of the beyond in particular. But you're no longer allowed hardly to think about deeper aspects of ancient societies. Here in Germany, the reason is that under Heinrich Himmler, we had these exemplary organization like the Ahnenerbe, the heritage of the ancestors and everything, where archaeological findings, contexts were interpreted in a Nazi fashion, like to prove the priority of, to prove the superiority of Germans, Germanics. And uh, as we tend to do in Germany, we fall from one extreme into the other. On the other hand, there's a similar tendency in Britain also, because what is defined nowadays as methodological correct can be described as a kind of Marxist views of societies, which are still, well, the basic subject of most archaeological studies. It's all put into abstractions, and everything linked to religion or to deeper thought amongst ancient peoples is kind of condemned as esoterical fancies, not serious, etc. But on the other hand, there's a good counter tendency coming up. But I'm afraid that well, as well as these good examples for wider horizons in thinking, my findings will perhaps be accepted in 1, 2, 3 generations. And then suddenly everybody will say, "Yeah, this was obvious, of course. They had to orient themselves." But of course, I'm not really a pioneer, because there were better people than myself thinking about this long before. Actually, you probably heard of Mircea Eliade, who was professor at the Sorbonne, so he cannot have been a complete idiot, but he is kind of described as not very serious, or well, this is not really relevant what he says, but one principle that is actually proven by my findings in archaeology, which are absolutely obvious. You just have to use a certain kind of look. You have to know what you see. And one of his fundamentals was in his book, The Myth of the Eternal Return, is that any society, when it moves to a new territory, this territory is structured. And how could it be easier structured than by the cardinal directions? The sun rising roughly in the east, setting roughly in the west, wandering throughout the year, but the north-south axis never shifts.
Mhm.
And actually to know where the northern celestial pole was, well, allows you for a perfect means for orientation.
Mm. It's true. Many of the theories that were very compelling from Mircea Eliade's time seem to have fallen into, well, I was going to say disrepute, oblivion. Um, and I'm thinking also of the Jean Richer, who in the 60s examined the Greek archipelagos and found the zodiac signs in various parts according to where the coins were found, and realized that there was a whole, well, that there were several centers around the Mediterranean around which the signs of the zodiac were placed, but over quite long distances, so that various people, various cities would have been under this sign or that sign. But again, those theories seem to have vanished. And I read something recently whereby, because cattle bones had been found in the Avebury enclosure, the enclosure itself was obviously a cattle market.
Certainly, that sounds very scientific.
Well, the evidence is there, so on the face of it, why not? But it's a different approach. But can you tell us more about your evidence? So what have you actually found? And what did the stones tell you and tell us?
Yeah. The,
Or the
the first,
swords, indeed.
the first step I took, actually, I tried to find out if there are articles mentioning constellations in the last 100, 150 years in European archaeology. And in fact, there are quite a few in Swiss archaeological journals, in French archaeological journals, in Danish, German, um, not so much in English actually. But my first step was to kind of have a look at the evidence presented up to then, and because these singular examples, they were always regarded by my colleagues as special singular things. They were not aware that there are loads of other pieces of evidence. So all these things were put away like, they want to see something in there, and this is just, this is just fantasy basically. So no need to worry, no need to think further about it. And already during this first stage of research, I could well secure that the Big Dipper is definitely around and was systematically represented, just because it is the easiest and most obvious asterism in the sky, even nowadays helping to identify the actual, well, fixed point around which everything seems to revolve. And another point why it was important in Neolithic times is that when Tuban, Alpha Draconis, was the pole star in about 2800 BC, which is perhaps known from the northern shaft of the Great Pyramid in Gizeh, which points due north. It was clear that the Big Dipper at that time was only about half the distance from the pole than it is now.
Right.
So it was even a much more reasonable thing to use the Big Dipper as a simple means to locate the pole, where there sometimes is a pole star, mostly not, than even nowadays. So the constellations I could find in Switzerland, for example, I was working at the Solothurn Armory Museum, and the weekends I spent exploring the surroundings with my bicycles and checking the cup-marked stones, which were published and sometimes mentioned in connection with collections by a researcher in the 50s. And they are still all there, and it still makes sense. But of course, as I am just, well, how could you say, I am a scientific soldier of fortune without a proper employment. This gives freedom, liberty on one hand, but it makes life not so easy when it comes to financial aspects. So I tried to view as many stones as I could. And already at that stage, this was in 2008, I found several examples for the constellation of the Swan, Cygnus, for the Big Dipper, Little Dipper, Lion, and then I went on to northern Italy, where there were several Orions also, sometimes even represented very close to the Milky Way. You had kind of a streak of cups, and below this was this Orion structure. You had 3 dots, 3 cupules for the belt, 3 for the head, and 2 for the feet. And all this is, in the meantime, I'm not even angry with people because they even refuse to look at the evidence. They just say, this is crazy. They didn't look at the sky. What people forget at the same time is that there was no light pollution at the time. They saw
No TV.
everything much, much better than we see now. It was much more easy to identify constellations than it is now. And when you look at world mythologies, actually, I wouldn't know of any where the origin stories of people are not tightly linked to origins in the sky.
Actually, I think yes, the same. I can't think of an origin myth that doesn't involve, first of all, the heavens and the earth being formed out of chaos, and then the various parts of heaven and earth being placed, so the sun and the moon and the stars and the trees and the animals and everything. So definitely, if we're only looking at the trees and the lie of the land and perhaps the way that the sun moves at a particular site, we're missing some of the picture.
Definitely. Say, as I never was in Northern America, but at least I read about it, so I make a little bit of publicity for this book. This is about Lakota star law, stellar theology, and all these principles that were mentioned by Mircea, Eliade, and other researchers, well, in most recent times, we have a book by Marinus Anthony van der Sluijs, Traditional Cosmology, where the fundamental role for the northern celestial pole or local meridians is it's just obvious. So of course archaeology may continue to develop itself into a means of administration primarily, where interpretation is kind of um, this is like interpretation is like garlic for vampires, so better stay away. Because if you dare to think something, you could think something wrong, and so it's better not to think than to think something wrong. This is the impression I get. People are no longer even ready to deal with different perspectives. But this is a phenomenon which is also true in political matters nowadays. So.
Perhaps it's the flip side of the scientific we, you know, when we know that and we think that, but you're only ever really part of the we if you think like everyone else.
Yeah.
When you found evidence in Europe, first of all, that seemed to echo what you'd found in Japan, how did you make sense of that? I mean, these places are very far apart, and they were from very different periods of time as well. So how did you reconcile those things?
This is actually this is very, very easy, and everybody can easily follow these steps, because I think it was in 2005 or 6 when I was in Tokyo, and I went to a fencing hall. I did my fencing practice there. I came out of the dojo at around 10:30. And in Tokyo, you don't see the stars very well because of, well, smog and light and everything. But this was a clear night in winter. And I looked up and I saw Orion. And suddenly I had a very, very warm feeling, or very good feeling, because I thought, well, from this moment on, in 8 hours, my parents at home will see the same sky. The people back home will see the same sky. So it is just at different kinds of day, at different times of day, that in the northern latitudes, we basically see absolutely the same sky. So we see the same most conspicuous asterisms. And from world mythology, we know that these asterisms were important, well, parts for mythology, representing deities, animals, anything you can imagine, really. Whales, axes, crooks. And this may be interesting too. Well, you could cut it out later. I'll fetch another book that was published about 2 months ago. Just a second. Even when speaking to professional astronomers, they seem to have difficulty to imagine that ancient peoples could have seen completely different pictures in the sky than the Greeks and the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians and the Romans did. But there is an author from Austria called Raoul Schrott, and he just published an atlas of starry skies.
Oh, wow.
And it is a huge compilation of an atlas of starry skies and the creation myths of humanity. These are 1,300 pages, and he deals with 11 cultures in detail, how they created their individual sky with different figures, constellations. And this was somehow very much water on my mills, because well, this is what any culture did. So we are actually just really at the beginning, coming close to the thought of ancient people.
when you were doing your work on the interpretation of the cupules that you found on the megaliths, how easy was it for you to then figure out how this was expressing precession? Like, did you have a kind of a moment then that it wasn't just that we're looking at the constellations as we see them now, because there is some kind of transfer, especially around about the poles, that things are shifting very, very slowly. So when did this occur to you, and how did you figure it out?
This started perhaps 2 or 3 years around 2009 after I started, because several representations of the Big Dipper were in combination with the star Tuban. There was a cupule in the position where Alpha Draconis, Tuban, is sighted even nowadays, but nowadays it's no longer at the pole. But at that time, this star was represented. So my simple thought was, well, this makes most sense for 2800 BC, because, well, if you represent a star, then there should be some significance of that star. And we know that Tuban was the pole star at that time. And when it gets into the Bronze Age, we have several examples in and around Stonehenge that I could introduce at a conference in Vienna in 2016. And but I've published this on Academia also, but no colleague would even look at it because, well, stars, this must be crazy. But of course, Stonehenge is the best example and the biggest and the most obvious for an early Bronze Age skyscape around the central monument. And the interesting thing about Stonehenge is, we could have a look at the presentation also later, that Stonehenge, the wooden face was built around 3000 BC. This was, of course, the time when Tuban was approaching its central position. And then after 2800 BC, it moved away again. And from the mound landscape around Stonehenge, where you have these hundreds of Bronze Age barrows, these date between around 2000 to 1500 BC. And at that time, it is evident that the center of this barrow landscape is no longer Stonehenge, but it shifted a little bit to the southwest, which corresponds to the position of the pole around 2000 or 1800 BC. And this is easily visible in the landscape when comparing it with Stellarium. There is even a local meridian which links the only 3 barrows where you have 2 barrows within one ditch, a double barrow. There is one in the southern group of barrows south of Stonehenge. Then there is one in the middle, very close to Stonehenge. And then there is one in the Cursus group north of Stonehenge. If you link these up, you get a meridian with a deviation of less than 2 degrees. And you can, of course, this will be, well, or this would probably be described as a pure coincidence, but purely coincidental. These are the only three double barrows in the immediate vicinity of Stonehenge.
These are just a couple of 100 meters south.
Let's have a look. It's Stonehenge. Open it up and oh, now I see. Okay, now I see that we start from the beginning. We'll yeah, go fast. You can see Stonehenge here. This was a very cold day in February 2016. And under the red bracket, you can see in the distance, these are the barrows of Normanton Down. Here you see them a little bit better. And you can even see, I think, now, no, I wouldn't dare to say which is the double barrow, but here we can see a plan. And the interesting things are here. And just to introduce, well, the real Big Dipper, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And here we have it mirror inverted. Check. This is quite detailed, actually. You see the Big Dipper here, and you see this star here, which is a little bit brighter than the surrounding ones. And here you have 1, 2, 3, 4 big ones.
Yeah.
You have this one in the position here, and bush barrow, which is that one. This is the oldest one in the area. So bush barrow was already probably extant when they built the others in the shape of the Big Dipper. Realistic enough, because at the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and the sixth star is the double star, Misa and Alcor.
Right.
And this is the only double barrow. So you have only here 2 barrows within one ditch in the position where you have in the Big Dipper the only double star here, Misa and Alcor. Although this may appear squeezed, and every professional astronomer may say this is not exact, but this is exact enough, because at the time this was built, the handle of the Big Dipper was no longer important to determine the pole. The handle was important around 4600 to 500 BC to 7000 BC, because when you used this line here as a sideline, you came up to the pole star at 5000 BC, and accordingly to the earlier ones also, because this would just be a tangential of the precession cycle. And at the time 2000 to 1500 BC, we will see the pole star was no longer here, Tuban, where it was when the first phase of Stonehenge was built, these three. It moved here, and nowadays we have it here. So,
Okay.
and then now let's move on to the Mircea.
That's an incredible correspondence.
Yeah, but of course purely coincidental. Okay. And here we have Stonehenge, and you see, in relation to this Big Dipper, Stonehenge is sited about in the direction where the pole was at the time. And of course, this is also an argument for Quentin Leplat's argument that they were measuring, they were planning, they were measuring, they were counting. This cannot be, this should not be questioned by rational people who say that people were thinking like us. They had the same intelligence, they had the same looks, they were perhaps a little bit smaller, but they were not by no means more stupid. Well, actually, probably we are much more stupid than they ever were. So it is kind of strange to exclude these possibilities. This is just a representation of
So just
yeah.
Stonehenge then corresponds to the North Pole according to this particular setup, to the way that it's been drawn on the ground.
Yeah.
What date?
At 3000 BC, there was the wooden face when you had the Aubrey holes, where they think there were wooden poles or something in it, and where it was also obvious that Stonehenge was, the concept was to have a burial ground, because in all of these pits you had loads of burned bone. And this is also something that is not so easily put into a profane context. This has nothing to do with agriculture. This has to do with images of the beyond. And another argument why I think it is not very intelligent to always emphasize the profane in archaeology, because our most important sources or types of sources were and are grave sites, funeral contexts, and not agricultural contexts or settlement contexts. We nowadays, many colleagues just try to switch over to say, oh, well, settlement archaeology is much more interesting than grave archaeology because we will never know what they thought. But actually, I think it is even now today, like even the concept of cosmological centralism is of fundamental importance. It's nothing to be made fun of. It's just
Yeah, I
and
agree.
how could a structure be more centralistic than a circular one, Stonehenge?
Yeah.
And you can be sure that the altar stone that they found out now, which is kind of a shame, they found out after more than 200 years of archaeology at Stonehenge that this stone doesn't come from the region, that it was imported from Scotland. And yeah, it's yeah, okay, but these are all elephants in rooms. And here you can
Different,
see on this picture the
different
three
ways.
lines, the three arrows point to this is the method how you can locate the pole today.
Okay.
This is the method how they did it at the time of Stonehenge,
Yeah.
at the time of the stone phase of Stonehenge, we have to be precise. And this is the line you would use when the first phase of Stonehenge without the megalithic stones was constructed. So
Okay.
three different methods to locate the pole. And this arrow is the method to locate the pole star around 5000 BC. And you can see that this method held true up until 7 or 8000 BC, because here we are at the rim region of the precession circle. And again, here now, it's easier to see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And the seventh is the double star. This is the a
Twin
painting
barrel.
of this double barrel. And I don't know, well, I'm an archaeologist, and we always have to look for uh, primary sexual organs or secondary ones. So I think, well, these could as well certainly be breasts. That is also a scientific interpretation. But yeah, I think they were meant differently. These are a plan of the stones, which is also published by English Heritage. And here it is from this Stonehenge laser scan report. And the most interesting stones for me are stones 4 and 5, because on there you have loads of different axe engravings. And I went there to see if I can see some. You can see one here. They are all represented edge upwards,
Yeah.
just as the axes that were found in Brittany 2000, 3000 years earlier, which were
Okay.
put in the ground edge up, and in Quiberon or in front of the menhir at Le Magno. And on the megaliths where they are carved, they are also most often represented with the edge up. So this is a continuity. And you can see that these red examples, they were discovered pre-2003, and the green ones were discovered in 2012 using laser scanning. So I'm not at all averse to modern methods, but I'm averse to using modern methods and then not thinking about the implications of what you find. It is just, you can say, oh, we have more axes, there are more axes, but there is no further thought why we have this arrangement here. And to me, this arrangement looks very much like a swirl.
Yeah.
We have a center here, and it looks a little bit swirling. This is just,
That's the stone there.
yeah, another example. And what they also did, and this is something that the professor who dedicated his whole life to the rock carvings in Val Camonica, he said that in this Stonehenge laser report, they completely ignored cupules. And in this report, it is written that all the cupules that are found, they are natural features, so no need to incorporate them. It's just as Mrs. O'Kelly wrote for Newgrange, there are so many cupules, basically they are just disturbing the appearance of the proper engravings, which is also, I think, a thought that is not very scientific. And you can see here on this photo, something they did not represent in the plan. because they were no nice axis. You can see,
Oh, so they've actually edited out anything that didn't
yes,
fit.
yeah,
Yeah.
you can see a kind of cupule here, and you can even see a kind of lozenge shape around it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
I see it now. Yeah, almost like
and
an eye.
yes, yeah, and this is not mentioned at all.
Huh.
And if you would put it in there, something happened with the presentation. It should be farther down. Something happened to the format because I wanted to put this in the middle.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, okay, now here we have it again. Now it's better. Yeah, this is how it should be. You
Right.
see, the actual center of the swirl would be where the two circles are.
Mm-hmm.
And you see the lozenge, which is a little bit off. So an off-center center.
Yeah.
And this is the same which we will see in the bigger picture also. For me, this swirl is kind of a symbol for the many Bronze Age barrows around Stonehenge. And the type of axe represented, you can easily see this, these are no longer stone axes, they are copper axes or bronze, well, alloy axes, dating to the first half of the second millennium BC. And there's even something else on this photo to the right. You can see that there's a kind of circular line here. And this is something that happens in France also. You can see that sometimes earlier engravings were kind of erased with
Okay.
like if you erase a pencil stroke.
Yeah.
So there was something round and big there apparently beforehand. This is just the evidence from this picture. And then, yeah, this is just my little game to display a kind of propeller. And I first thought of this propeller when I saw this map in the Stonehenge Visitor Center.
Right.
You can see that here is Stonehenge. This is the famous avenue.
Yeah.
And you can see the barrow groups here, 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 here.
Yeah.
Actually, I wouldn't dare say they were Nazis in the Bronze Age, but it looks a little bit like a swastika. And funnily enough, you will note that the center of the swastika is not here. Stonehenge is off center, but the center is here. There is a distinct group of burials in the center of these four groups. And of course, everybody will say, well, yeah, these groups, they are on the ridges around Stonehenge.
Mhm.
Of course, there are these ridges, but these also may be one reason why to put these things there in the first place. To create a kind of landscape, a centralist monument consisting of dozens and dozens of barrows representing a cosmological view. And this is the, well, the schematic plan.
Okay.
Here you can see this meridian, which I thought of there, but now it's getting better. There was this joint program, what was it called? Stonehenge Landscapes, I think, between an university institute in Austria and one or two British universities. Actually, there were two projects at the same time. And as is usual in archaeology, they did not exchange very much because their respective heads had different views on what they are finding or on the origins of Stonehenge. This is quite interesting too. And here you can see, this is Normanton Down. This is the double barrow in Normanton Down.
Okay.
This is the, on top, this is the double barrow. This is the central one, Amesbury G10. And the third one is Cursus J17. And you can see that this line is about 2 degrees off from true north. And so my impression, this would demand further excavation, but this will never happen. That the barrow here was just made to correct this meridian, but both lines, the green one and the red one, they both touch the central double barrow. So they are completely enough for a symbolical meridian going through this center, which is represented by this group around this double barrow. And there is no other double barrow. And you can see that east and west are lined out by two outliers, one in the west from Winterbourne Stokes. This they could not detect anymore by this ground radar, but it is there in the old publications. And there, new king barrows, there is one outlier to the south. And if you link these up, and there you have a newly discovered barrow just on the east-west line, and this gives a very nice grid system with the center here. You have east and west there, north-south lined out here. And this is just the beginning. I made another presentation that is also completely ignored, because there is a very nice representation of Leo just south of Normanton Down, and actually Leo is sighted under the Big Dipper in the sky. But this is
well, that's very important evidence as well. What do you think is the purpose of these four groups, these four arms?
That possibly, well, this is very hypothetical now, but this is what my colleagues do as well. They are probably, well, burial sites for elites of different groups from Britain. As we know from Stonehenge now, that once or twice a year, well, especially once a year around winter solstice, people assembled in Stonehenge from all over Britain, including Scotland, including up to the Orkney Islands. So you had different tribal societies, or I don't know the political correct term at the moment, or the one which is most political correct, well, but some groups of different societies that they buried their bosses or their kings and queens, because you have quite a few ladies there also, in these barrows inside of Stonehenge, inside of this new center, which represents, in my opinion, definitely the shift from an older center around 3000 BC, which they appear to, my daring explanation for the megalithic phase of Stonehenge is that they wanted somehow to cement Tuban as a pole star.
Okay.
But of course it didn't want to stop. So people got in ritual troubles. And about the time when these barrows were built, around 1700 to 1500, Bush Barrow being perhaps the first one around 2000 BC, they were already well aware, okay, it's still going on, it's still moving away from this wonderful bright pole star and moving on. And so they shifted their ritual center away from the megalithic structure.
Yeah. Wow, it's incredible. And to have the same landscape functioning in a similar way over such a long period of time.
Yeah. And this is something I'm also amazed about in Brittany. You have continuities spanning up to 3,000-4,000 years,
Yeah.
which is much longer than our Christian era now. And so I cannot live well with this axiom that a culture is completely different from one another if its rim shapes of their pots are different. You cannot compare one culture to another, but they all lived under the same sky. They had similar images of the beyond. Well, as is obvious from the dolmen customs from Scotland to Scandinavia to the Mediterranean to Northern Africa even. So we have to prepare to well, meet much more surprises yet. And can I stop this here? And I would like to show you the lion.
Please, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
What, while you're doing that, what do you think it would take for people to start considering this seriously?
I don't know. I think a professorship would help on my part. But I never had these ambitions. No, we'll have to look here. Yeah, no, I wonder, first of all, probably a proper publication, so I have to put it into a book form at some time,
Mhm.
but which is difficult because I have to earn my living in a completely different field, which is also fun, ancient arms and armor, but
Which we must speak about on another occasion.
yeah, it doesn't leave much time. Do you see it, or is it?
Not yet, not yet, but I'm sure it'll come in a
Then
minute.
I have to share again. Zack. Where are we? Zack. Where is Zoom and share? And the lion Wilsford. Zack. Here we are. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. This is Leo and Behold, the Lion of Stonehenge.
Very good.
And this is, yeah, you can see the group where it's sited. Actually, it's south of Normanton Down. Here is Stonehenge. Here is the center of the Barrow group, the Stonehenge Down group, defined by Mr. Grinsell already in the 70s. And here we have Wilsford and Lake and Winterbourne Stokes. And there are three other groups which have unquietening stellar parallels. This is how do you say, ordnance survey with the megalithic monuments. And now here we have the the plan of Wilsford, of the Wilsford group, south of Stonehenge, and here we have yeah, then it's the next one. This is the Lake group. Yeah, and here you can see another very detailed rendering of the Big Dipper and several weak stars within Ursa Major, which goes into really much detail, which again is not so surprising because, as we said before, they saw the starry sky much more undisturbed than we do now.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So
That's
this is
incredible. So these barrows also depicting the same
yeah,
asterism.
yeah, because the Big Dipper was the most obvious means to determine the center, the cosmological center.
Mm.
And it may sound strange, but even in medieval Christianity up to the 14th century, my last written source is Dante's comedy, the Divine Comedy, where God lives, God as the mover of all, he is living at the pole. And so there's even a poem by the Archbishop of Tours from the 11th century, where, to make it short, it says the good lives in three dwellings. The first is on earth, the second is below the earth, the third is above the stars. And then he
Right,
precises the first is the house, the second is the grave, the third is the pole, polus. It
right.
cannot
That
get
is
more
very
polar
specific.
than
Yeah.
polus. And
Yeah.
but what the Catholic Church did actually to kind of disguise this esoterical fact is that they sometimes tend to translate polus as heaven in general.
Ah,
This is
oh,
just kind
yeah.
of very yeah, cunning.
So that over time it would dilute. But what would be the purpose of trying to disguise or undermine this knowledge, do you think? Why would
It
people do this?
it would mean to admit that people had this knowledge already long before cosmological knowledge. They had detailed cosmological knowledge long before the Catholic Church took over.
Mhm.
And when looking at this precession hypothesis concerning the Mithraic cult. This makes even more sense, because if Mithras was the god of precession, of course he was close to the pole also, which suddenly makes sense to the only Mithras liturgy preserved, where the seven guardians of the pole were the seven stars of the Big Dipper. And so this was just to keep this knowledge away from people. And of course, they studied it in monasteries. But as we have seen before, the constellation drawings, they were just beautiful figures with dots on them. They were not nearly as accurate as things like these.
So
And
they've been inherited over time, but their scientific purpose, if you like, or the astronomical observation has been somehow diluted or lost over time, and they've been preserved as somehow just symbolic. Is that
yes,
you're right?
yeah,
And so
that
you've
makes
mentioned
sense.
you've mentioned the possible practical purpose of being able to align a monument to true north and for navigation. So this would be very important for those things. And you've mentioned also the cultural significance and the mythical significance of having awareness that there's a center around which everything moves, and perhaps you could say the unmoved mover is determining this, or the forces, the cosmic order, whatever you want to call it. Is this in a way a sense of celebrating the life forces that are governing us? Is this, could you read into something a little bit more and connected maybe to some of the myths about heaven and earth and the forces that govern our lives, according to the myths?
Definitely, you can all put this parallel with yeah, human life, just as the moon phases and everything, and Indians do it in different tribes in Northern America. They did this, the Greeks did this, the Christians well, some of them did this, but I don't actually, I'm not so sure why astronomy was deemed so terribly dangerous and suppressed. It still doesn't make too much sense to me, yeah.
Mm.
But yeah, now I've lost the thread a
It
little
does
bit.
and it doesn't. I mean, I suppose they were very interested, perhaps I'm talking about the church, in Aristotle's work, which contained some errors by our standards. So they were interested in knowledge and to a certain extent in science, but only insofar as it agreed with Aristotle, perhaps, or perhaps that they just,
Yeah,
for example, we all know what the difficulties Copernicus faced. But this is so interesting to think that science was alive and well a long, long time ago, and you've found ample evidence for this.
definitely. I'll just I would like to still show you the lion, because
Please go
this
ahead.
is the
Yeah.
most obvious one. This is the lake group, where you have the Big Dipper in detail with all the bright stars visible. And again, as in Normanton Down, you have somehow squeezed down the handle of the dipper, just because it was not this important at the time. And number one is an earlier barrow, earlier Neolithic barrow, which happens to be in the place of this little star. But well, as this was the first, they probably arranged everything else according to this older monument. But this is now this is a parade example, because here you can see the plan of the Wilsford group drawn by Mr. Grinsell, published in 1978. And you see the brightest stars, and you see several not so bright stars. It is just, well,
Yeah.
I will listen if people tell me that this is coincidence, but this is one example of hundreds of coincidences. And as I have to do this research as a kind of a hobby, it is definitely certain that I just can present here the tip of an iceberg. And we've not even yet moved to
Yeah,
Brittany.
that is absolutely incredible. Where is this situated on the ground in relation to the other constellations, or in relation to Stonehenge itself. This
Yeah.
is in terms of
We'll go back. All these groups are
group.
in this.
Oh, I see. Yes, just there. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
these are just the situations and the placement of these groups. They are just facts, and that they correspond to circumpolar asterisms, including lion. It's just a fact.
Absolutely incredible.
And for example, well, you are now in Ireland. I'm in Black Forest, but the most important, or well, a book really worthwhile reading is, you know, John O'Neill, the Night of the Gods.
Oh, yeah, I actually haven't read that.
This is amazing. It was, and he wrote down loads and loads. It's 2 volumes like this, all dealing with polar myths all over the world. And he was a clerk working for the post, but a very intelligent one who didn't have the noble or, well, gentry privilege to study what he wanted, but he became a good postal clerk. And so he was trusted with very difficult tasks. And aside from his tasks at the post, he was even sent to Japan. He studied Egyptian hieroglyphs, Mesopotamian writing, Japanese kanji, Chinese kanji, all this just to write his book about polar mythologies. And of course, this has been completely ignored by archaeology or by university mythological studies, although he may well be considered as a precursor of Joseph Campbell, who wrote this 3 volumes, the Masks of God, which is a very nice term for different mythologies.
Which I'm reading. Well, I'm reading The Hero with 1,000 Faces at the moment. You haven't mentioned Hamlet's Mill, but that's another great one.
Yes, and actually, I tried to introduce my findings at the Institute for the History of Science in Frankfurt, where Mrs. von Dechend was teaching. And the whole book also is about evidence for ancient cultures knowing about precession. And this has always, just for the very reason that they brought evidence from all over the world, this exemplary approach was put down because people said, oh, they threw together everything and they mix everything up. But there is no need for that because actually, as we said before, when you live in certain latitudes on the spherical Earth, you see the same sky, and the sky always had influence on culture. And when they were, it takes about 3 generations to note that something is moving, that the pole is no longer in the same spot that the grandfather saw it. And there is one, it's a physicist from northern Italy, it's Giulio Magli. He wrote a nice book about archaeoastronomy also, and he has a very nice chapter called the Discovery of Precession before the Discovery of Precession. And he is also absolutely certain that the principle of precession was known well before the 2nd century BC, before Hipparchus of Nicaea wrote it down. And in the meantime, in what I find out in Brittany, there is evidence that they were already aware of precession in Mesolithic times, so that this flourishing of a circumpolar cosmology in the 5th millennium BC, it didn't come from nowhere, and there was no need for extraterrestrials. It is just everything points towards the circumstance that already since the 12th, 13th century millennium BC, they were aware of precession in Brittany.
And it's actually very reasonable.
Yes.
Because they didn't have TV, they were watching the night sky. They had the same brains as us. So at least probably more intelligent than us in some ways. At least they didn't destroy the world like we have. They didn't need any particular equipment to see this. They obviously were inventive because they managed to track these movements and record the passage of time. We know from all the various books that you've mentioned and the studies and other collections of myths as well that these themes were very important to them. And you've discovered evidence on stones, on weapons, and also on the landscape on a very big scale of these constellations, but also not just the constellations, but the fact that they were moving along and they were adapting with precession, with axial precession. It's absolutely, when you put everything together, it's incredible.
I think well, I hardly dare think so, because if you look what is turned into scientific sensations every day on the internet, this term has become so oh God, the inflationary.
Oh yes, yes.
That it is very difficult to come up with a real sensation. For example, when it comes to cartography, it's been 2 or 3 years that a group of French researchers published this article, or it was published 1 or 2 years ago, the first man-made plans to scale dating to 6000 BC, and this were the plans of desert kites in Saudi Arabia. And of course, this has not yet found entry into European prehistory because, of course, well, what do we want to learn from Arabs or Japanese or Chinese? So this has not yet entered. The next thing is that you have this slab of the Saint Belek mound in Brittany, which has been largely covered by the media 3 years ago, where they say they have a kind of map of the area of the Ode River. And this may well be, but at least they have a very much more precise and accurate star chart of the sky around 5000 BC. And of course, my colleagues don't even want to consider this because they have decided that this slab, due to lack of erosion, cannot be earlier than 2000 BC. But why present, then I would ask, well, then they were even bigger geniuses because they presented the night sky around 5000 BC on a slab dating to 2000 BC. But this weathering argument doesn't really count, because if this stone, as many megaliths were, as we know, if it was used secondarily, and if it was created for an earlier Neolithic grave, then of course there would be no opportunity for it to weather under the sky or something.
Well, stones are very difficult to date, aren't they? I mean,
Exactly.
the markings and the positioning of stones, and I know that that's an argument by some archaeologists at Stonehenge, in that they would say that the various stones weren't all in the correct places at the right time in order for them to work as sort of an analog computer to map the risings and the settings of the sun and the moon. Who knows? It's very difficult to date stones, but I think the evidence that you've presented is really amazing. I think we should really take this seriously. I think that it's consistent and it fits in with work from other perspectives, anthropological, mythological, and it's just incredible work. So really, I must congratulate you on this work. It's absolutely fantastic. Thank you. Thank you for sharing it.
You're very welcome.
Please, everybody, have a look at Dr. Stefan Maeder's website on academia and the rest of his work. It's really incredible what he's done. So have a look at it. Stefan, thank you so much for talking this evening. It's been really amazing and an absolute pleasure. So thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.